I do want to acknowledge everyone that was involved in the trial. I think all of these PowerPoints are going to be made available, and I don't want to run through everybody, but really without the leadership from the QPS, this trial would never have taken place. And I particularly want to acknowledge Sarah Bennett, who managed this trial in the field, and she's was a major factor that made the QSET trial successful. What I'm going to do is follow on from Tina's presentation, and the big policy implication that I had from QSET beyond what Tina was saying about it being rolled out into different contexts was if you do use a procedurally just approach during random breath testing encounters, and they do have a positive result, how many RBTs across the state are too many? How many would be too few? So I'm going to present the macro findings and what it means for random breath testing in Australia. Tina provides some really good background information to QSET, so I won't go over that. The main point was that it was actually run in Metro South region of the Queensland Police Service. And the entire idea to run the trial at the point of random breath testing really did come from Assistant Commissioner Peter Martin. It was, we wanted a very simple encounter to test the key principles of procedural justice. And because that encounter is very easy to control, for the first time that we wanted to test it under experimental conditions, the random breath test encounter was something that we could control in a relatively easy way. It ran from December 2009 to June 2010, and there was 60 random breath testing stationary operations randomly allocated, 30 to the control group and 30 to the experimental group. Tina has provided a schematic of the actual, it's a very, very basic two-arm trial where the control group was business as usual and the experimental encounter involved a script, and that script directly operationalised the 4 key principles of procedural justice that Tina earlier talked about. Everyone knows what a random breath testing stationary operation looked like. The QSET trial took place at the point of the stationary operations. They didn't include any of the ad hoc random breath testing that that police do, and it didn't include the very large booze bus operations. So these were district-controlled random breath testing operations that typically involved about 6 officers in the line, all delivering the prescribed speech, whether it was a script, whether it's the standard random breath testing encounter or involved the procedurally just encounter. Peter Hoskins, the embedded police fellow with CEPS, was fantastic, and he went to every single one of the 60 operations to make sure that the police delivered the treatment as was prescribed. Tina mentioned about the differences between the experimental control group in terms of encounter length, and the experimental encounter was about 4 times the length of the control encounter. And the basic responses, there's a research brief, CEPS research brief out, so if you're interested in having a more detailed look at this, you can have a look on the CEPS website. But in terms of how the random breath testing experience changed their view, did it change people's views on drink driving? The experimental group was 1.25 times more likely to respond yes to that question than the control group. And it also enhanced the way that the experimental group looked upon the police, and Tina's done some additional work looking at that variability across different ethnic groups. For every single one of the key outcome measures that we looked at, there were statistically significant differences between the control and experimental group, which I have to say I've been doing policing research for a very, very long time, and to see these kinds of findings across the board are really quite amazing. So the big policy question for me was, okay, so we know that QSET and the QSET procedurally just script it works. It works to change people's views. People feel better about the police. But from the outset, I wanted to say, well, if we were going to change random breath tests, and in Queensland they have what's called a 1-to-1 ratio, so for every one licensed driver there's got to be one random breath test per year. So there's about 3 million licensed drivers in Queensland, and the target is to do 3 million random breath testing across the state of Queensland per year. And I, from the outset, felt that if we were to have a longer random breath testing encounter, to do it within budget, the police would have to come off that 3 million target for random breath testing so that they could start to engage the community in a more procedurally just way. So that was really what motivated us to start to look at what we call these macro data. So we started to look at the cost of alcohol-related crashes. One fatal alcohol-related crash costs about 2.67 million. The cost of hospitalised injuries is about 266,000. So you can really see that, you know, traffic fatalities that are alcohol-related are really a serious problem, and they have enormous cost. Across all of Australia, there's about 12 million random breath tests done every year, and the cost to Australian policing is about $71 million, so it's not an insignificant amount of resource allocation going into this activity. We've worked out that it's about $5.92 per random breath test, and that takes into account all the fixed and the variable costs. And the average time for a random breath test across Australia is about 20 seconds. Don't know why that is. So in terms of, and as all of you know, I'm certainly not a random breath testing traffic policing scholar, but I think that this macro question is actually very important. So random breath testing was rolled out starting in Victoria in 1976, and actually Queensland was the last state in Australia that adopted random breath testing. In terms of some of the initial effects, what has been studied to date was when it was rolled out in Victoria, they initially saw a 10% reduction in alcohol-related fatalities, and it was as high as a reduction of 48% when it was introduced in New South Wales in 1982. In terms of the current ratio of random breath testing to licensed drivers, Queensland has a target N of 3 million per year, which translates to what's called a 1-to-1 ratio, one random breath test per one licensed driver per year. But the standard across Australia is about 1 to 3. Western Australia has a 1 to 3 ratio. Victoria, from what I understand, has a 1 to 3 ratio. And that we've looked at why is that kind of like the standard across Australia, and it's because in 1989 Ross Hommel was asked the question how many random breath tests should be done, and you know, he really there wasn't a lot of research around, and suggested that at least a 1 to 3 ratio would be the minimum that police departments should aim for. So what we did was we tried to do a comparison of a state similar to Queensland that had a 1 to 3 ratio, which is Western Australia, and to see what the differences might be. The whole time in the back of our mind was that if we were going to increase the encounter length of random breath testing, how far off that target of 3 million random breath tests per year in Queensland could we come? So Queensland and Victoria are very similar, but they certainly have somewhat more of a drink driving problem when we looked at other research. Than Western Australia has more of a problem than Queensland. So what did we do? Well, in step one, we got the WA data and plotted the number of crashes that were involved people with a blood alcohol content of over 0.05, and looked at the numbers of the raw numbers of random breath tests per 1,000 licensed drivers. So what you see from this graph is that the random breath tests per month actually fell from the early 2000s from about 83,000 per month to about 49,000 random breath tests per month in WA. It is starting to kick back up again in the last year. And in terms of the number of crashes, it was steady at about 77 crashes per month, and that's increased now to about 88 with a kick back down at the end. So then what we did, step two, is we overlaid the Queensland data, and yep, I will be finished, thank you, Susanna. And what we see is a steady increase in crashes in Queensland, but a very steady rate of random breath testing in Queensland, so it's grown proportional to the growth in population. So in step three, what we did was fitted the line to look at the rate of crashes per RBTs. And what you can clearly see from this graph, so the blue graph is the WA data and the brown graph is the Queensland data. The state of WA has a 1:3 ratio, Queensland has a 1:1 ratio, and what you can clearly see is that the ratio of 1:3 RBTs per licensed drivers has actually led to a proportional increase in fatal alcohol-related crashes, whereas in Queensland, the brown graph at the bottom, as there's been a population growth, the number of RBTs has increased, and that's maintained a very steady level of fatal alcohol-related crashes. Now, what this is just a different way of presenting the data, where we put all the WA and the Queensland data together. What this graph really shows you is that there is no point of diminishing returns, which basically I'm absolutely wrong when I felt that the Queensland could come off that 1:1 ratio, reduce the number of random breath tests by, from maybe 3 million to 2 million, and increase the length of the encounter. It's wrong, they can't do that. If they did do that, their number of alcohol-related crashes would go up. And this graph actually shows that the more random breath tests that you do per licensed driver, the more impact you're going to have. And we can't see a saturation point, which I'm quite surprised about. Mind you, the traffic officers that were doing the QSEP are not surprised about that at all. So the way that it fits the data, there's 86% of the variance explained in the models. It's explained by the numbers of random breath testing. It translates for every 1% increase in the ratio of random breath tests, there's a 13.6% decrease in the number of crashes per 10,000 RBTs. And if WA even doubled the number of random breath tests that they did, they could see a significant drop in the number of alcohol-related traffic accidents. So now that I know I'm just about out of time and I don't want to take up time from my colleagues, in terms of how this all translates, we've worked out that it's about 4.5 million if WA doubled their number of random breath tests. If they, by not doubling their number of random breath tests, they're actually costing the state about $16 million by not taking on that responsibility of doing more random breath tests. So it's a 4 times greater cost to the state of WA for not doing the random breath tests relative to the number of licensed drivers that they have. So at the end of the day, we want to work very closely with ANSPA and with the different police agencies to start to call on some national standards around the ratio of random breath testing. We think it should be a minimum of a 1:1 ratio. we think that that level of saturation needs to be very consistent. So it needs to be consistent by month, and it needs to be consistent across different geographic areas. And clearly, where there's hotspots of alcohol-related traffic accidents, then there can be an increase relative to other locations. We do think that there's still value because we know that procedurally just random breath testing encounters actually can change people's view, and so there is some benefit in terms of changing people's view to alcohol driving while under the influence. And we've looked at the data very carefully, and we think that they can increase it to about a 40-second encounter and get a bigger bang for their buck. So without a huge amount of cost, that would cost about an extra 50 cents if the police doubled their encounter length from 20 seconds to 40 seconds, but it would have a massive run-on effect in terms of changing people's views. So in terms of optimising random breath testing, 1-to-1 ratio, and increasing it using a procedurally just encounter from about 20 seconds to 40 seconds. Okay. So am I one question? Okay. So thank you, Susanna, for keeping me on task. Does anyone have any? I think we've got time for one question. Mark, you've been beaten at the hand. One, okay. Alistair? Yeah, certainly. Yeah, so we're now in the process of getting all the other state level data so that we can take a really careful look, and, you know, it's a naturally occurring experiment for them to have gone from 1 to 3 to 1 to 1. Yep. Okay, thank you very much, everybody.